Okay, welcome everybody to today's lecture about Nietzsche. This is part of my philosophy course. I've done some other videos about Spinoza and a lot of the pre-Socratic philosophers and Stoicism and Epicureanism. So if you're into philosophy, please check out those lectures, I suppose, or classes or discussions on old philosophers. We're moving on to Nietzsche today, and he's someone who is very often misinterpreted, I think, and I think that's partly Nietzsche's fault. If you look at a lot of his books, he writes a lot of aphorisms, he writes a lot of paragraphs, really, where he talks about one topic and then about another topic and then about another topic. And it means it's very hard to find a system in his philosophy, but I want to show that he does have a system. And to do that, I'm going to use the book in which he shows his, in which he talks about his philosophy in a very systematic way. And that is on the genealogy of morality. So if you want to have a look for this book online, you can find it very easily. Just type in Genealogy of Morality PDF, and you'll be able to find a copy of Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality. I really recommend the Keith Ansel Pearson version. He's got a nice clear essay at the start of the text, and there's some excellent supplementary material at the end from some of Nietzsche's other books, which talk about things that he mentions in the Genealogy of Morality. So it's a very good book, this particular one. If you're starting to read about Nietzsche, if you're starting to read his work, I really recommend starting with something like the Genealogy first. One of his books where he's actually writing in an essay format. It just makes it a lot easier to see where he's coming from. So I really recommend starting with the Genealogy of Morality, and not something like Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is really poetic and very difficult to understand if it's your first book. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention first. Secondly, he has a very different style of writing to say, the previous philosopher Spinoza. Spinoza writes in a very direct way, and I think it's much easier to see clearly what Spinoza is saying. I think it's a little bit more difficult with Nietzsche. However, with the Genealogy of Morality, he makes himself very clear. So let's talk about what he discusses in this book. Now, this is a book very much about ethics. The last book we looked at was called Ethics by Spinoza, but the majority of that book actually talks about epistemology and ontology. It discusses problems of the mind and the body and the structure of existence, and only in the last two chapters does it start to move on to ethics. But it was a very important question for Spinoza, and it's a very important question for Nietzsche, ethics. It's really what Nietzsche talks about most of the time. And so Nietzsche asks us, what is the value of values? He wants to know what the value is of having an ethical system. Does it have any value? And what kind of values does it have? What kind of, how can we interpret a moral system? And so he doesn't seem to like, he talks about some other people who he calls the English psychologists, and he doesn't like their genealogy of morality, because the English psychologists have explained where they believe morals come from. And really, he's talking about the social Darwinists. We have had a lot of people in England who have tried to explain the origin of morality from a Darwinistic viewpoint, from a Darwinistic perspective. And so they try to explain how morals have evolved slowly over time, how altruistic behaviour has evolved, and they try to do it in terms of evolution, in terms of Darwinism. And he gives an example of this. He says that these English psychologists, they usually find the origin of morality in utility, in usefulness. They say that morality is useful for mankind, and this is why it's developed. They suggest that good acts were first praised by the recipient of the good act as useful, And after a while, it became a habit to carry out good acts because they were praised. And in the end, you felt that you were doing something good yourself, even though at the beginning, in the origin, it was only the recipient that called the act good. Now, Nietzsche found this story highly unconvincing. Yeah, he thought it was absolutely wrong, that this was not where morality came from. He had some very different ideas about where morality came from, and he thought that this was particularly naive. In particular, I've underlined this word, the recipients. They say that something is good because the recipient feels it as good, and so the recipient is the one that labels the action good first of all. And it's only over time, after it becomes a habit, that the doer of the action feels the action as good. Now, Nietzsche found this particularly ridiculous. He was absolutely certain that if you looked back in time, and you should remember that Nietzsche was a classical scholar, he was an expert on ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and he loved, reading all of those old books. And he thought that he had found something in Greek and Roman culture which wasn't around in the Judeo-Christian world. It wasn't here. And it was a system of morals. So for Nietzsche, the origin of morality, morality was formed when a superior class of individuals, you could call them the masters, you could call them active people, he calls them artists, he calls them a number of different things, but he means a strong group of people went around, and because they were stronger, they subjugated an inferior class of people. Now, this is very important in Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, any kind of body, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a physical body or a legal body, a state body, an institution, but any kind of body is always composed of two different types of forces. And these two different types of forces are always battling against each other. And one force will be a dominating force, let's call that the superior force, and one force will be the dominated force, that's the inferior force.